Welcome to the Cabin Culture Podcast, where we spend a little more time diving deeper into all the fun parts of cabin culture. We like to think of this as both the material and imagined expressions of how cabin lovers, dwellers, builders, and designers wish to live a more simple and authentic life. On this episode, we're talking to Will Jones, who is the author of the newly released book called Cabin. And here's what I love about this episode. One of the reasons that I wanted to start a podcast was that while I loved the community that I was finding on social media, who all love cabins as much as I do, the conversations were mostly short form via DMs or comments, and it lacked the kind of depth that I really wanted to dig into when it comes to this world, culture, all of it. And Will Jones felt similarly. Rather than go the podcast route, he went the book route and really dove into not just how to build a cabin, which he covers a lot of that, but also the history of cabins and cabin culture. So if you ever wanted to know more about where this whole world might have started or are thinking about building your own cabin, this is the book for you. And on this episode, we cover some of all of this. So while we go a bit deeper on a podcast, the book is really all the way there. So thanks for joining us and excited for you to listen. Hi there.
Janice, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Thank you. Can you hear me properly?
I can. Yeah, that's great. If I were to try and imagine what your background would have looked like while reading your book prior to seeing you, this is exactly what I would have pictured. So while this is an audio format of podcast, we do put it on YouTube too. So for anyone listening, if you want to see, it will be exactly what you're imagining in your mind, but I love it.
Well, it's my office, so what can I say?
So you are not at the cabin right now?
No, the cabin, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no internet. It's a nice place to be when I'm away from all this.
Which is actually kind of nice because our cabin has Wi-Fi and all of that because we host guests there. And while I feel like that's a necessity these days, it definitely gets in the way of my ability to like truly step away, which is, as we'll talk about, part of the purpose of a cabin. So welcome. I'm really, really excited to chat with you. You are the author of the new book called Cabin. Shared about it on social media. A lot of folks, honestly, I don't think in the last year, it probably got more responses when I shared about your book than almost anything we'd shared, which just speaks, I think, to the desire of people to hear more stories, full-length stories, not captions on social media, but like real depth when it comes to cabin culture. And I think that's what you've been able to do with this book. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into that. Can you take us back to the beginning, where and when cabin culture first became part of your life, like pre-book, pre-your cabin, but when you look back now, where did it first start for you?
I guess there's always been something in my life that wanted to go live in a cabin, to be away from society, to strike out there on my own. Even when I lived in England, I was looking for places to step away from the city, the humdrum of normal life, and to really experience something different. So in England, you can go and stay in a cottage, that kind of thing, in Wales or in Scotland, and they're lovely. But still, there's too many people. It's a small island with 60 million people on it. So you never really feel that you can get away from it. Now, moving to Canada, coming on holiday to Canada, I very soon realized that you can find that space. I mean, I'm always looking for information. I'm always looking for tidbits. And I found that just recently I've looked on Haliburton County, where I live in Ontario. There's the population density is 4.4 people per square kilometre. Now, compare that with Toronto, that there's 4,000 people per square kilometre. Then you sort of see where I am and where I want to be. So moving to Haliburton, finding this spot, finding a home by a river with 3 acres of land, which doesn't sound like anything here. People own hundreds of acres, but for me, it was so much. It was like paradise compared to England. So then you start to realize. I mean, instantly that I came here, I talked to my publisher, and told him where I was, and he immediately imagined me in a cabin in the woods, divorced from society, which is not where I am. I mean, I'm 10 minutes away from Halliburton Village. I'm 15 minutes away from the nearest grocery store. So no, I'm not in the wilderness, but and a certain aspect of it, I guess I am, because I can look out my window, I can look down the river, I can see a deer
Yeah.
in the garden or a moose walk by, or that kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's the wilderness to me. And so then I realized, well, I'm in a house, I'm in this amazing place. Now I want to really go the extra mile and build myself a cabin, find a place where I can really be at one with nature.
Yeah. Do you think that's something? I mean, you've done so much research, and we're going to get into the contents of the book, but do you think that's something that all humans need? Or do you think it's personality specific? This disconnect, when I say disconnect, I actually mean connecting with nature, but disconnecting from the 4,000 people per square kilometer.
um, I think all people should be able to experience it, not necessarily, they won't necessarily want it, but I think it's something
Mm.
that everybody should be able to experience at some point, because it is so different, and it does make you think. It makes you think about yourself. It makes you think about your surroundings. It makes you think about your real life and how you could make it better, how you could change it, how you don't want to. Maybe the if you're living in the city and that's what you want. When I first got I got my first publishing job, I moved from a small village in the centre of England to London, and the editor of the job said, "You'll either hate it, you'll be here for a week, you'll love it, you'll manage 10 years, but then you'll get burned out, or you'll really, really enjoy the city life and you'll never, ever imagine moving away again." And I did my 10 years. I started to feel burned out. He was right. It took me 15 to get out of London and to Canada. But after 10 years, yeah, I knew it wasn't for me. It was a great place to be when I was younger, but
Yeah.
now, yeah, it's not what I wanted.
Which is interesting in reverse, thinking about the connecting with nature and getting out. It's almost like phases of life call for different things. And in my 20s, I considered working in New York City. And in my 40s, I have absolutely no desire and would rather move to rural Maine than do that, which actually brings me to one of the first quotes from the book that really stuck out to me. And it was the start of chapter 4. You were getting into the building portion of it. And you said, if in reading this book, you are thinking of embarking upon building a cabin, you are most definitely at the foundation stage, which is true, and the beginning of an adventure that will establish a new chapter in your life. And I love how that put that into context, because so many of our listeners have built cabins, are building cabins, or want to build cabins. And what I think you don't realize at the beginning, but you do by the end, is that it does change your life, where you spend your time, how you spend your time. So I'm wondering, can you give us the context on your life? If you were to name the chapter before your cabin, the chapter of your life building your cabin, and now the chapter that you're in, what would those 3 chapters look like in contrast to one another?
Well, I mean, the chapter before the cabin was a transition from London, England to Halliburton, Canada, which is from a vast metropolis into a rural setting. So it was it was a real transitional part of my life. My wife and I, we planned for we came on holiday to Canada. We we decided we wanted to move here. We put in for our visas for immigration. It took 4 years, and in that 4 years, we planned and planned and planned. We also, towards the end of the 4 years, we had a child. So all of a sudden, we've got a baby, and 8 months after he was born, we moved to Canada. So we got this little tiny being. So it was a real new part of our lives anyway. We moved here. We bought a house within 6 months, and so it was change,
Yeah.
and it was a wonderful time. And but I guess it it set in motion something that I really, really wanted to do, because it made me realize that I was here and I was nearly at the point where I wanted to be. I got myself, I imagined when I came here that I'd be able to carry on my freelance writing career from a spot in rural Canada, which was entirely impossible. Um,
Mm.
I met with a friend. He gave me a job. I was a carpenter back in England a long time ago, and I started to work for him. So then the next phase, I guess, was me starting to rediscover my love of construction.
Mm.
I've always written about architecture. Previous books have been about always showcasing or telling the story of other architects and designs and that kind of thing. So now I'm building again. I'm building these wonderful cottages, beautiful spots in the middle of middle of paradise as far as I was concerned. I mean, my office tomorrow morning, I will be on a construction site. It'll be freezing cold. It's probably about -10 tomorrow morning. I hope it won't be snowing. It may well be, but you'll look out across a lake and just think, wow, look where I am.
Yeah.
And that's I love the construction aspect of my life, and so I've now come from England. I've re-engaged with a career I had many years ago, and it's enabling me now all of a sudden I'm thinking about, so this is, I guess, it's the second chapter. I'm thinking about being able to build my own cabin. I'm thinking about building my own piece of paradise. And I mean, it was 6 or 7 years of that before I really thought, right, I can do this. I found some property, looked at it. It took, we walked the property, me and my wife, and now I've got a little boy that's wandering around on his own. Um, we we just we took our time. We found where we wanted to build the cabin, and then I could begin to start building the cabin. And with that, I realized I wanted to document the cabin. I wanted to document the build. I wanted to, as initially for myself, and initially just as I guess nearly a how to build a cabin.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I started to think about, right, I was taking photos all the time, that kind of thing. Now, the more I started to think about the book or think about a possible book, I realized how to build a cabin book. I mean, you've been to the bookstore, you've gone online. There's thousands of them. There,
Yep.
you could find every size of cabin. You can find books with plans in. It wasn't something that was going to be something that anybody would even want to write about. So when I finally approached my publisher, we talked about it, and I came up with the idea. It's not really, my book isn't really a how to build a cabin. It's more of a why to build a cabin book. It's it's the inspiration. It's the whether you're looking at the history of log cabins around the world or in America, whether you're thinking about what would be the things I really want to engage with when I build a cabin. So is it the nature? Is it the wilderness? That kind of thing. That's the book. It's why you want to build a cabin, and then it's got
Yeah.
the bits that might tell you some about how to build it. But please don't copy it, because
Yeah.
you can build far more than I did, which is basically a sleeping shack. So.
Yeah, but what I loved about the structure, this really stood out to me because, Will, this is so fascinating to me because when I started my build, I thought the same thing. I'm a visual storyteller, so I do video for a living. You're a writer. My instinct was, how do I document what we're doing? How do I document it? And I chose Instagram as my medium. And there were lots of frustrations with that, but lots of things that were really helpful. You chose the medium that you were comfortable with, which was writing a book, right? And I think it's kind of, they're very two different mediums. And I think that's why I enjoyed this so much, because Instagram is so shallow and you can't put anything in order because it disappears within a couple weeks, basically. And I really struggled with that, of wanting for it to be sequential, how we went through it. And it doesn't work like that. But that made me really reflect on the structure of your book. And it felt like there would be a chapter that gives context and then a chapter with more details on kind of how to do it. For example, chapter 7 is called Nature, the Reason to Be Here. Chapter 8 is weatherproofing the cabin, right? So you do it seems like you went back and forth between like cabins around the world, finding a place to build, right? So it's like, okay, here's the theory and the research behind it, the why, but then here's also a little bit of the how from your own experience, giving that practical hands-on. So for folks looking for books to read about cabins, I felt like that format was really fascinating. Did that come to you right away, or did you have to play around with different formats to figure out how to do that?
That is predominantly down to a very skilled publishing team.
Okay.
I've come up with an idea. I listed the chapters I wanted to write about, and I'd got the bones of the book. But then you talk to the publisher, and my editor at Thames and Hudson in the UK. His name's Lucas, and he's a wonderful guy that's been doing this for years. So he just looked at what I'd got and came back in a few days, really, with scribbles all over, obviously digital scribbles, but all over what I'd done, saying, look, we need to reorder this. Let's do, and the back and forth is their idea, because it, like you say, it makes it something different. It takes it away from being just that, okay, so half a book's going to be how to and half a book's about other cabins. We're trying to intertwine the story of my cabin with the stories of cabins, the wilderness, etc. It gives it something extra. I mean, I'm so pleased with the book because it's such a wonderful package. I mean, not just I love what I've written. I think I'm hoping people will like that, but the cover, the feel of this hardback book, the different coloured pages, the different coloured chapters, the beautiful sketches by Sarah Obtanala. I mean, just everything about it. I spent 2 years writing this thing, and I see digital everything of it. But then when you actually get the book in your hand, then it feels really special. I was so pleased when I first saw it. It's amazing. I hope everybody else likes it as much as I do.
That's such a good analogy of where I feel like cabin culture is right now, because it feels like so much of our time when it comes to cabins is spent scrolling the internet, whether it's Pinterest or Instagram, and looking at these visual pictures. But when you actually get someplace and are in it, that feeling is so different than what you get from just scrolling, looking at pictures. So I love that, of like how it felt when the book arrived. Okay, I want to go back to what you were saying about where you built, because I love your description of it. So chapter 2 was finding a place to build. I'm going to read one portion of it, and then I have a question to follow up on that. But you said you were talking about the land and the site, and you said it has the site on which my cabin sits has many faces. It changes constantly with the seasons, with the weather patterns from day to night, even with help from the industrious beavers. But always it is peaceful and my personal idea of perfection. This perfection is what I'd urge you to look for when choosing a place to build a cabin. Strive to find the immeasurables, the ideals that will bring your dream to life, because if you can tick off those elements, you are on your way to success. And that is one of the number one questions that I get asked all the time, is about finding land and how do you know? And especially in today's real estate market with interest rates and prices, it feels so high stakes to find the right piece. How did you know, and what advice would you give other people? I mean, that is beautiful advice, but do you have any practical advice of how folks should approach this?
Unfortunately, it's always very idealist, especially once I've found the land now for me. But it, my my biggest piece of advice would be to take your time if you can, and hopefully with the downturn in the realty market, and there's not this just rush to buy thing. People buying, I mean, where I live, that people were buying land sight unseen. Within a day of it coming on the market during COVID, it just went crazy. The prices went up. Nobody was getting the chance to be able to consider what they could build, where they could build. I mean, you need to go and visit the land, walk the land, and feel it. Be able to feel that you're at home on it. Yeah. Not just go and find a good building site. It's not a case of just, oh yeah, we could build something here, but connect more emotionally with it. And I mean, ideally, go and see it in different seasons. But obviously, if you're trying to buy a piece of land, that's not going to happen. But
yeah, very rarely do you have the luxury of like a year to think about it.
Exactly. But on the other hand, maybe you do. Maybe you approach a landowner before they're even thinking of selling it. Maybe it's not a piece of land that's for sale. It's a beautiful spot that you've seen that the owner might consider selling it if you approach them. It's you've got to make your own luck really, and then you've got to be able to you need to be able to connect with the land. That's the thing.
And even if you don't have the luxury, I feel like a good takeaway from this, even if you don't have the luxury to wait a year to buy, it could be really helpful to wait a year before you build. And once you've found a piece of land and you're like, okay, I think this is it. Well, or I've bought it, so this is it. But visiting it in every season to experience different parts of the land and figure out where the cabin fits in to that piece of land during all the seasons, what you would feel and experience from this spot, in fall and spring and winter.
Exactly. I mean, with somewhere like where my cabin is, the seasons, it changes so drastically because there's a river, and the river comes up. The river rises 6-8 feet in the spring. So where you might, if you visited the site in summer, you see a river that's 5 feet below the bank. It looks small, it looks lazy, and you just think, oh, that's cute. You visit it in April, May, when just after the snow's melted, and there's this rushing river that bursts its banks and races through the valley, and obviously half the sites would be impossible to build on. So,
right.
Yes, you got to do that, but it's about. I mean, I keep going back to connecting, but it is about feeling where the most perfect site is, feeling where you feel that you can really imagine the cabin being built, and what you're going to look at from the cabin, what you're going to. I mean, again, it's taking your time. If you bought the site, visit it through the seasons, because the smells, the sights, the sounds of different areas, whether you're in the shade, whether you're in the sun, whether what happens in the spring, what happens in the fall, it really matters. Some of the places where we build cottages, you go there in the summer and these cottages are under you feel like they're under a canopy, nearly in the dark, because there's this massive maple trees all around and hanging over them. Now, this time of year, it's just, the difference is phenomenal because there's no leaves on the trees. It just changes the whole feel of the site, and you need to consider that before you build a cabin.
Yeah. I want to go back to the connectedness piece, because something you wrote in your pre-interview questionnaire was so it hit me really hard, because a lot of the conversations I've been thinking about myself recently are the world of cabins and how it's become a bit more commercialized is like the best way that I can put it. And we're renting them more, and it's becoming more like this business. And if you're renting them, then you're marketing them. So there's just like this whole other cabin culture that feels quite different from what most of us are seeking and what most of us like first thought about. Okay, so here's what you said. You said there's too much emphasis put upon making a profit from outdoor experiences. I understand that people want to do this, but building and owning a cabin should be about much more than return on your investment. Let's talk about treading lightly amidst nature, enjoying the moment, a bee on a flower, a muskrat snake-like tail as it swims by, the clouds on a stormy afternoon, the things that can't be purchased. And I think, because I do rent mine, this is a constant tension of how you focus on those things. And then when I notice them, it's like, okay, well, I should share this in our listing or on our Instagram so that other people know what they can expect, right? Which inevitably takes away from your own experience, your own presence in that moment. And I just think that's important to like point out, because most of the people who listen to this podcast are cabin lovers, but also rent or share their cabins with other folks. And I felt like that was a really good way to ground kind of what we're doing. You also said in the book, I don't want to like read your own words back to you too much. Is it annoying when people interview you and do that and then just like read your words back to you?
No, because you read them a lot better than I would say them myself, so it's
Okay.
lovely.
I just want people who haven't read it to understand like what that content feels like, because it was one person wrote to me and said, can we make a book club about this and read it and then get on Zoom and talk about it? And after I've read it, I feel like that would actually be really good, because so much of us I think you made me think in ways about a lot of the things that I've been like struggling with lately. So on page 11, this one's short. You said, "For my part, I too am a European settler in a new world, but one who tries to live alongside the local population, be they of settlers' roots or indigenous." And that is a struggle that many of us are grappling with, not only where cabins are located and where that land came from, but also renting cabins in communities that we don't necessarily live in full time. And that, so can you talk to me about how you think about that in your cabin, both when you were building and the local population being both animals and humans and community? Like, how did you think about that during your build and even before your build?
I thought a lot about the how I would interact with nature because that was what my cabin was about. But I mean,
Yeah.
we should explain, I guess, for anybody that hasn't seen the book or images of my cabin, it's not the cabin you'd rent. I mean, well, I guess you could, but it's a 10 by 10. It's a box with a bed in it. And that's what I wanted. I wanted something that was for me alone or with my family, just to be able to experience nature and experience the quiet and the solitude. So it's not like these beautiful cabins that you guys have got that you rent. I mean, and I understand a lot of people that you build a cabin, you've probably got to rent it in order to make some money back because it's cost you a fortune. But you've created your dream. But you've now got to be able to support that. So that's fair enough. I people said to me, one or two people said to me, and I think I write about this right at the end of the book. Some people will see my cabin and immediately say, "Wow, you should put that on Airbnb. You'd make $300 a night." And other people say, "Oh wow, I'd really love to be here because I imagine it's quiet. I imagine it's amazing." And I err towards the second person because that's what my cabin was built for. So
Yeah.
I, but I totally understand if you if somebody wants to rent a cabin out because there are so many people in this world that can't afford to build a cabin, haven't got any land to be able to even build something small like mine. So to enable other people to experience that is a really wonderful thing in its own right. With regards to what you were saying about how you feel like every time you see something, you feel the need to share it. I I mean, I really understand the fact that you do. It's that one of those things. If you go to an event and you spend all your time taking pictures, you don't experience the event. So sometimes you have got to step back and think, yes,
Yes.
this is for me today. Put down the camera, put down the phone, just enjoy life today, rather than constantly feeling like there's something that needs to be shared. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's everybody's life. That's social media. That's why I like writing books rather than doing Instagram. I'm on Instagram. I have a few followers. I follow lots of people on Instagram, but I like a book. I like to write a book because I can take my time and I don't feel this need to constantly share, constantly make people aware of what I'm doing. I can step back from that for, like I said, 2 years to write this book, and then finally it comes out. Now people can see it, but I've taken my time. So that's
Yeah.
me. I'm old, as you can tell. That's why I like writing books rather than Instagram.
I feel like we need more of that though. And I do feel like the younger generation hopefully is starting to realize that while social media has a ton of value, it is very shallow. And when I was reading this book, I felt like it really let me sit in cabin culture in a way that I don't when I'm just scrolling and consuming short form content from hundreds of cabins versus long form content from one cabin and one person. It's kind of how I feel about the podcast versus the social media conversations I have. These feel personal and with more depth than a post, a caption that like caps you at what 90 words or so. I think it's probably more than that. But like, it's almost impossible to go deep there. And in reading this book, it felt like it had that depth, which is like something I'd love to ask a little bit more about, which is the amount of research that you put into the history of cabins and cabin culture internationally. Like it wasn't just in Canada, it was all over, the origins of where this started. I was really thinking about this when I was reading it. Did you do this research before you started the build, or had you already built your cabin and then you went back and did this research?
It was during the build, because I started the build. I talked to my publisher, and we came up with an idea. And he said, "Show me some pictures of the build." So then I started photographing it, and he liked the idea. So the book was developed alongside the build. In Obviously, the book took a little bit long. I mean, the cabin took about a year to build, and that's just me in my spare time. And then the book too. And so by halfway through the book, the cabin was built, and I was able to start really getting to know it, be in it, and then helped with some of the later chapters in the book, or some of the chapters like the nature, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was a nice way of doing it. But the research, I mean, again, more plaudits to my publisher. I came up with ideas. I wanted to do, yes, let's do log cabins. Let's do the history of log cabins. He said, well, this is an international book. You need to research internationally. You need to find out about other forms of cabin. So then you start to find out about the Height in Norway, and the Bothies in Scotland, the Dashers in Russia, all these different places, different, they're not really cabins, but yeah, different buildings that people have used initially a lot for actually living in or working in, now predominantly recreation. And then you start to really, I mean, I didn't know that there was a bothy association in the UK, which I should explain. A bothy is a shepherd's hut in Scotland, predominantly Scotland and Wales, on the moors, so the big lonely hillsides, where a shepherd is often used to push sheep onto the moors, and then live there with them for days at a time. And every now and again there'd be some really bad weather, so they'd need somewhere to hide away from the weather or to get warm. And these things can be a nice little hut, a nice little stone cottage, or it could nearly be a mound of rocks that's hollowed out that you crawl into in order to get out of the weather. These were built, hundreds of years ago. Often they're still there because of their stone. So now in England, or in the UK, sorry, there's a bothy association. You can go. There's a list of them. You can go and you can stay in them, and you stay for free. You can, but it's not like coming to a cabin like I can see where you are. It's a stone cottage that's probably got a plank bed and a fireplace.
Right.
And there's no running water. There's no, you bring your own wood for a fire. There's no food. There's no electricity. It's a really sort of rugged rural experience, and it's something that I never even knew existed till I started researching the book.
Yeah. So this goes back to, this is a question that I normally ask at the very end of the podcast, but it's like almost impossible to not ask it right now, which is what makes a cabin a cabin? And I feel like you are probably more an expert than anyone I've talked to because of the amount of research you've done, but they all seem so different. And what you're describing there compared to what a lot of people are calling cabins now, what would you say are the defining characteristics of a cabin?
That's a really difficult question to answer,
I
because
know.
my cabin, as I said, is 10 by 10 with a bed in the middle. It's got an outdoor privy. I have a barbecue and a fire, and that's it. And I feel that's the essence of a cabin. But I've got friends whom I know you've interviewed at Fort Treehouse who
Yeah.
have built an amazing. I mean, it's, if ever anybody goes and looks at this, it's called the Baltic Treehouse. Any young single person would happily have it as a home. It's got
Right.
kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, living room, running water, heat. It's an amazing place to be. Is it a cabin? Yes, because it's not a home, but it's certainly not rustic or raw, or it's got every mod con. And I don't know whether that you can count that as a cabin or not. But now I've got to be careful what I'm saying, because I'm looking at the leather chair behind you, and you obviously you're in a beautiful, beautiful cabin.
I'm at my house, actually.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm at
You're in
my
a
house
beautiful
now.
house then.
Yeah.
But I've seen pictures of your cabin and your videos of your cabin. I mean, it's an amazing spot. But it's high end, isn't it? Would you call it a cabin?
I go back and forth on that all the time. I think one of my big issues during our build was the interior drywall. And I was like, can it be a cabin if it has drywall? Like that just didn't, I wanted it to be more rustic. And so that's when we added like tree cookie walls. And
Yeah.
so when I'm in it, the piece that makes it feel like a cabin is the size because it's small ish.
Mm.
It's not 10 by 10, but it's 800 square feet. And most houses you don't find in that size. And then the tall, like vaulted ceiling that's all wood with the cross beams, that always like, it always feels like a cabin to me. And we did as much wood as we could, but I don't know. I've said this on almost every podcast. I don't know if it's a cabin. I'm going to call it one for marketing purposes and for our life. Like we call it the cabin and we go to the cabin, but I don't know. I see other ones like do you know Pete Long?
No.
He's a architect and builder in Canada as well, and his first cabin was very rustic and off grid, and he designed ours, but ours is more on grid, a lot more
Yeah.
on grid, and his feels like more of a cabin to me. So I don't know. And
Now,
what I
is
go
that
ahead.
because it's off grid? Is that something that you immediately go, oh, well, now it's different?
It does feel like if it's off grid, that almost immediately puts it into that category in my mind. It's interesting. This hasn't come up before whenever we talk about what makes a cabin, whether or not off grid, but off grid versus a hot tub.
Yeah.
Like that feels like it should disqualify me immediately, right? Versus like you have to go to an outhouse or something.
But then again, how many people would actually want to do that? I mean,
That's the
it's
problem.
yeah.
If I wanted to build it in a way that I didn't have to rent it, I would have had to wait till I was 60. And I was like, if there's a way to do this sooner, that was my big driving factor. My mom was the most frugal person ever, saved for retirement her whole life, and then died at 60 from breast cancer and never retired or got to use all that money. All that. I don't know how much it was, but whatever we were like saving along the way. And it made me really rethink how I live my current life rather than living for retirement. How do I take the things that I dream of for retirement and can we make it happen sooner? And so for us, renting was a requirement. And I was like, off grid, would that rent in the same way as a
Yeah.
heated bathroom floor? Probably not. But to your point, it changes that connection with nature. It does feel like off grid puts you one step closer to nature versus a hot tub puts you one step further from it.
Yeah, but the experience sitting in the hot tub and experiencing nature, then
True.
then it's wonderful.
You are right because it faces the rock. And when there's snow covering the rock, it is like the best part. It's like, I'm not going to sit out here in the cold necessarily. But now that there's a hot tub here, I'm going to sit out here a lot and appreciate that. But it's a tricky balance. We've
Yeah,
talked about this a
that's the
lot
thing.
recently of how you get new people who don't have the desire to connect to nature. How do you introduce them to it in a way that maybe one day they'll now want to stay at an off-grid cabin, but previously had never considered anything besides the Hilton?
Exactly. I mean, it's an introduction, and
Yeah.
and if that's what people want, that's what people want. You know, you're if you're marketing something, if you're trying to make money from it, if you need to make money to pay the mortgage for it, it's got to be something people want. Now, from my point of view, I don't care about that because it's not. I don't want other people there without wanting to be
Right.
rude about it.
Right.
A lot of my friends come and stay and they love it, but it's I didn't build it for that reason, and I spent virtually no money building it because I used offcuts and scraps from the construction industry, from jobs that I work on, in order to build this for nothing. So yeah, it's my cabin's different to your cabin. What is a cabin? I don't know the answer. I don't think anybody really knows the answer.
Yeah. But it makes me think about most people when we ask them that talk about some sort of wood, right?
Mm.
Like it needs to have that feeling of being a log cabin or like lots of wood. And when you're describing these in the UK that are rock, I'm like, well, I would never have considered something made of rocks a cabin, but that is a big part of the history of cabin culture.
Yeah, I mean, and but that's people using what's close at hand, isn't it? I mean, in England, they don't call the bothes or the small houses cabins. They call them cottages, or or bothy, or So, but then you see you come to Canada and they call everything a cottage. It can be a 3,000 square foot flat roof modern home with windows all down one side looking at the lake, and they call it a cottage. We've just built one. It's over 3,000 square feet. It's the most exquisite house that I could ever imagine living in. And the couple that own it said, "Oh yeah, we didn't want much. It's beer and Birkenstocks. This place is. It's $2 million worth of beer and Birkenstocks. But it's their cottage. It's
And maybe that's the answer right there. Perspective is reality, and all of us are coming at cabins and cabin culture with a very different perspective, but it doesn't make it any less real for us in the context of our lives.
exactly, yeah,
Though that is hard to think about as a cabin, but a very nice
yeah,
one. So it was interesting because you went into the history, you started with the overall history of cabins in different places, but later in the book, you got into famous cabin dwellers. So I thought it was really fascinating to go from like groups of people who created different kinds of cabins to individuals. And some of those are folks, Thoreau, we're very familiar here. We often teach it in high schools with Thoreau and, that experience with cabin culture. But the one that I thought was really interesting was, and I don't know if I'm going to say his name correctly, but Dick Proniki. Do you
I
know how
think
do I say that?
I think it's Prunike. I don't know
Okay.
either. I've looked and I've tried to find exactly how you pronounce it, and there's different pronunciations.
Well, so in that section of the book, he has actually written his own book, One
Yeah.
Man's Wilderness, an Alaskan Odyssey. And a couple of the takeaways that you wrote about were the true value of patience was the first one, which I think applies so well to the way that you talk about your build, both in spending time on the land and observing it over the course of time before building, but then also the way that you built using materials you had at hand. I love that description and that connection between how you did it and how like the cabins in the UK, not cabins, how do you call them?
Cottages, bothies.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, the
And
bothy.
and
Yeah.
the bothy, that's like a similarity between the two. You're both using what you have on hand. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about your build in the spirit of the true value of patience? How long did it take? How did you phase each portion of it? What did that look like for you?
Um, I mean, it took just over a year. Um, I I collected materials for it for possibly a year before that. Looking at each job we'd work on, there'd be some offcuts, some pieces of plywood, pieces of 2x4, rolls of asphalt for the roof, that kind of thing. And it was all those little bits and bobs that I collected. My wife hated me because there was a big pile at the house of all this garbage. So that's what she called it. Um,
The
and
logistical realities of a cabin build.
Well, exactly. And I think I mentioned at one point we tore the windows out of our house. We redid the windows in the house, and there were all these big wooden windows. So I tore them out and stacked them behind the shed at home, and thinking I'm going to be able to use the double glazed units out of them in order to use as windows in the cabin. Now, and there was patio doors that I took out and stacked to one side. And that, now, by the time I got around to using them, the patio doors had rotted. I broke most of the windows trying to get them out of the frames, that kind of thing. So some stuff worked, some stuff didn't. And sometimes I had to buy elements of it. I spent money on the base, which is all just it's pressure treated timber to create a base for the cabin. I bought that new. The rest, the stick frame for the walls is offcuts. The insulation was all odds and sods at off building sites. Some of it was rigid, some of it was that's a soft pink insulation. It was what I could find, what I didn't have to pay for. I paid for the pine boards, the rough sawn pine boards on the outside of the cabin because I wanted it to look nice. But I think in all I spent about $2,500 on new materials. Other than that, it's scavenged.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky because I'm in the construction trade, so I've got that resource there. Other people won't have. But at the end of the day, if you walk past the construction site and see there's a load of stuff stacked up by the side of a dumpster, ask somebody. They'll more than
Yes.
happily give it to you for most of the time because they just want to get rid of it and not pay to get rid of it, which is what
I was
happens
just
anyway.
gonna say it would save them money a lot of times because they're
Exactly.
paying to have it removed.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, we're donating a lot of the materials off our job sites. We're donating to a local school because the shop class can't afford to buy materials. And so the stuff that we are going to throw away, the school wants. I mean, that's how valuable construction materials are.
Yes.
So, yeah, it was.
That's so
So,
smart.
yeah, and so my build, yeah, it took just over a year. It was, I did it on weekends. I took the odd vacation, worked on it. I did it when the weather was good. It was a case of just there was no rush. There was no deadline. It was a case of it was finished when it was finished,
Yeah.
and that makes it all the more enjoyable. If you're pushing to get something built for a deadline, then it starts to get stressful. Well, that certainly wasn't what I wanted building a cabin to feel like.
Yeah. Which is such a good point of it being just as much about the end product as it actually is about the process. And I know I have a quote written down here somewhere where you talked about that, which I'll find at some point. Um, but I think that's an important thing to keep in mind because a lot of us who are ultimately renting it have this feeling of we're pouring money, pouring money, pouring money into it. And we can only start like really affording it once we start renting it. So that deadline is always looming of like, when can we get our first guests in to like start replacing some of that money? But what I'm finding through conversations with lots of people in this stage is that the build process is actually, for the most part, not all that enjoyable because you're just feeling that anxiety and stress. But when reading your book, it was a good reminder that you can choose a different way, and a way that makes the process be just as enjoyable as the end product.
Yeah, you can if you've got the luxury of being able to do that. And
Yeah.
I'm thankful that I have. But then I'd have to go back again to the size of my cabin compared to something that you've built for
Yeah.
rental. It's cheap, it's easy. You can scrounge enough material to build something that's 10 by 10. You can't
Yeah.
scrounge a lot of material to build something that's 800 square feet.
Yeah. Yeah, but I kind of like that. One of my friends, Tyler Tuttle, he was on the podcast, is he's not building from scratch, but he bought kind of an older camp on a lake, and it's just for him. He's not renting it. So they go up all the time, and every time there's like one project that he works on,
Mm.
and it's like as budget allows or as time allows, it's functional without it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'm not photographing it and trying to market it to anyone. And so then when you're done though, the pride and everything that you've actually created makes that end product even better too. It's just so hard. So many of us are caught in the crunch of like building one, and then if that one's successful, then it's like, well, I guess I should build another one, and like continuing that churn, I guess. And I think there are benefits of that. Don't get me wrong. People who listen to the podcast regularly know that this has been on my mind a lot for the past like couple months of just how we're like scaling this industry and getting further from some of the purity. And in reading your book, it really reminded me of like childhood me who would sketch out cabins on graph paper, right? Where it wasn't about renting, it wasn't about like income, it was just about what is the space going to feel like. And I think my husband and I still have a dream of building a small one on our own one day when we do have the luxury of time, which we don't right now, but one day trying to tackle something like that. What was the best day of building your cabin and looking back?
Um, the best day. There wasn't one best day because obviously the day that I set the first cinder block down to build the base on was an exciting day. The day that I put the roof on and the windows are in, so the building was watertight, was a great day. The day that
Yeah.
it was completed, that. But then I mean, again, because I was doing it on my weekends in my own time, every day that I was able to be out there. So I have to stress this again. I've come from England, small island, lots and lots of people, to rural Canada. Every day that I go to work, and the guys at work just hate me for saying this because nearly all of them live around here. They've been brought up in this, what I call a paradise, and some of them don't really see it because it's just normal to them. But
Right.
to me, every day that I pull up on the construction site and look out across a lake, over a river, over an amazing valley, it's just it fills me with joy. And so to build my cabin, it was just that day, every day when I was there. So, just to sit, I put the base down. I made, effectively, there was a floor with a small deck at one end, and I sat, and my wife had made a cup of tea on the fire, and I sat with a cup of tea looking out on this base. There's nothing else. There's no walls, no roof, nothing. It's like a 10 by 10 dance floor, is set effectively about 3 feet off the floor. Just sitting on
I love
there with the river sort of slowly gurgling, in front of me. It's just like, this is the best time ever. And that's the way I feel about my cabin and about Halliburton. I don't, my wife will strangle me for saying this, but I don't feel the need to go on vacation, because I feel like I'm in a place where I'm constantly on vacation. So, because it's so wonderful.
That really is the dream for everyone.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you can get there, I feel, I mean, obviously I've emigrated to it, so it's slightly different from most people, but it's just a case of finding somewhere that makes you feel like that. And I feel very, very lucky that I've been able to do it in my cabin life, but also in my working life predominantly as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Okay, so make us all feel a little bit better. What was the worst day of your build? Tell us there was one bad day.
I'm going to spoil that one because I can't really think of a bad day. I mean, there were things that I won't say went wrong. I mean, this is going to make you really annoyed now. But the roof on the cabin, it's quite a special shape. It curves in two directions. It's like if you imagine a saddle that's been flattened out.
Uh-huh.
That's the shape you get. So you get the curve from the front to the back, and then you get the curve over the sides. And it's not something that I designed. It's not something that I said, right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a hyperbolic paraboloid. I decided I was going to I built the walls, and then I thought, what am I going to do for the roof? Well, I want to do a single pitched roof. But I thought, well, I'll only sort of raise one corner of the cabin, so that if you imagine you've got three corners of four that are all at virtually the same level, and then one corner's raised by about 2 feet.
Yeah.
And that gives the slope. But as you put the rafters on from the 2 feet raised, slowly coming down, all the rafters are straight, but it creates this curve. And I put the rafters on, not really thinking. I thought, I'm going to get a strange shaped roof here. And then I stepped back and thought, oh, that's kind of different. I could sort of see something was weird in it. And I panicked a little bit because I was like, how am I going to be able to cover this in plywood? So then now I'm scrambling to be able to sort of, I've done something that's interesting, but I don't know what I'm going to do. So I guess that was a sort of a bad moment, maybe. But I got a piece of a 1/2 inch plywood that I'd got from a job site and tried to put it on. And there was just this nice gentle curve. The plywood wouldn't go down. So then I had to find 1/4 inch plywood and lay that down. Then I started to see a curve. Then what was a panic moment became sort of a bit of an hallelujah moment, because I realized now I've got this wonderful sort of gradual curve on the roof. And so now 2 layers of the 1/4 inch plywood made something that was really, really special out of something that was not a mistake, but was definitely something that made me panic for a day or two.
Yeah. No, that's a good answer. We just needed to know that something went wrong. But that's the beauty of doing it yourself, and being someone, you luckily had a lot of experience going into this, but being able to improvise on site and figure out, how do I solve this problem, and also potentially create something beautiful that years from now I'm going to look back and remember like where that came from. Most of us, let me not say most of us, myself and probably some other people, paid builders. So I wasn't on site every day. So I'm sure that might have happened in places, but I don't know that story because I wasn't there and wasn't part of that phase of life for the cabin, which is kind of hard, a hard part of really like being as deeply connected to it as you are with yours.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the thing about building your own spot. It's it, it's about more than the end product. And it's the blood, sweat and tears that you put into it. And if things do go wrong, it just makes when everything's right at the end even better. And it's also, I mean, the scale of my building as well. To build on such a small scale means that you do something wrong, it's not the end of the world. You've not wasted thousands of dollars of materials. It may be a couple of $100, but you can probably repurpose it, or you can add on to it. You can, and and also you're not building. I'm not building to rent. So if something doesn't look quite right, it it doesn't really matter, as
Yeah.
long as it works and as long as you can enjoy the cabin. You can get over the quirks. There's one of the famous cabin builders in the book, R.D. Lawrence. He talks about building his cabin and mentions that there is a hump in the floor and a bow in the roof, but he doesn't matter. He doesn't care because the cabin's watertight, the cabin's warm, it's cozy, and it's
That's
where
right.
he can be at one with nature. So
That's
it
right.
all works.
Yeah. I feel like actually that is a criteria of a cabin that I'd never thought about before, is some level of quirk to it. If it's too perfect, to me, it doesn't feel like a cabin. And again, that was one of my concerns with our build. And it's why I intentionally put in white pine floor, because I was like, that's going to get scratched up real fast. And that's
Mm.
what I want. I want that personality. I want that, like, people have been here, we've lived here, we've dented it, we've scratched it, we've brought our pets, all of those things. Because when you do hire a builder and you're paying however much money, you obviously don't want necessarily quirks to be built in. You want them to do it right. So then how do you create those quirks that make it more of a cabin and less of a very expensive small house?
Yeah.
I think that line can be fine, at least in the cabin world that I find myself in right now. And how do you integrate some quirks that maybe didn't come from me messing something up when I built it?
Yeah. I mean, I find other aspects like the pine siding that I've used on mine. It weathers with age. It's something that you just every season you go to it, it's a different color. There's a different there's a different stain. It's like using cedar. When you start out and you put down a cedar deck. It's this beautiful yellow gold color, and it looks phenomenal. But by the next season, it's turning silver. It's turning
Yep.
darker. It's something that's showing the passage of time. And your
Yeah.
your your white pine floor, that's it. It shows the passage of time, the journey that the cabin's taken, and that's what I love. I mean, it's something. It's tactile. It's you can understand. People have been there. People are using it. It's growing with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is something beautiful, as much as I feel like I'm kind of like talking bad about renting it. I really like that there are lots of stories in the cabin and it's not just mine. And we hear a lot of them in our guest book, but some of them you just wonder about and you see and you know that people have had experiences there, that in a space that you've created for them. And there is something beautiful about that too. But though, as Pete and I talked about, sometimes you wish you knew those stories and you don't always. If it's just your cabin, you know all the stories that are to be found on the floor, the walls, wherever it might be. You have the context for all of them.
Yeah, but with the rental, it's to go back on what we said earlier on. You're bringing it, you're bringing the ability for people to enjoy a cabin to so many people. And I mean, and their stories, they're going to, you can just imagine what they're telling their friends when they go back to urban life, where,
Right.
it's, that's what people need in this day and age. People need to be able to get out into nature, to stop. Cause, one of the reasons I moved from London, England, was because I was sick and tired of living in the city and the constant barrage of traffic and media, and it was getting me down. I needed to escape into nature. Now
Yeah.
I did it quite, I went whole hog and moved across the Atlantic, but obviously just to have come from Toronto to Halliburton to stay in a cabin for a weekend, the release of tension and pressure is just phenomenal for people. So,
Yes.
being able to rent that, being able to allow these people to create their own stories is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've ended up building relationships with a lot of them. Some I never hear from, and that's totally fine. That's the experience they needed. But some, you end up building relationships with them, and there's something cool about having a friendship with someone who cares about this space as much as you do.
Mm.
And this space is a part of their core memories in the same way that it's a space of yours, and you can share that. And there is something beautiful about that. But it's interesting because the world in which I exist in when it comes to cabins is so highly visual. It's like if you follow us on Instagram, you know every corner of our cabin. But when reading your book, there were pictures, but a lot of them were hand drawn. It left a lot to the imagination, I feel like, in that you can kind of like take this information and put it within your own context. Was that intentional?
Initially, the book was going to have, there was going to be no photographs whatsoever. It was all hand drawn images.
Yeah.
The publisher decided that we needed some photography to break up the chapters. Really,
Yeah.
I think if I'm right, there's a photo at the start of each
Yes.
chapter.
Yeah.
And you know this better than I do now.
I have it right in front of me. So yeah.
And I guess I would have liked even more sketches. I mean, the sketches are so wonderful, and I would have liked more. But it's the publishing industry. There's so many pages, there are so many words, there are so many sketches. We can't afford any more sketches, was what I was told at one point. So
Yeah.
it's it's just all about economics. That is. Now, if that leaves a little bit to be desired, if that leaves some mystery, fantastic. Because that's what you want with a book. You want somebody to be able to read and come up with their own ending, come up with their own ideas.
That's right.
From a book like this.
That's right. Because folks, I call them dreamers, but the ones, this is where I lived for like 35 years of my life, but where you might go stay at cabins, you might be reading about cabins, you might be following cabins on Instagram, but you haven't yet built one. And I feel like your book is such a good starting place for those folks, or not even starting place, but some place before you've actually built, to get a lot of extra context. And I thought the number of pictures were perfect because it was enough. The sketches were enough to give me some details on the things, the people that you're talking about, but left enough to my imagination that I could apply it to my own cabin or to a future cabin or whatever I wanted to. It makes it very accessible, I think, for a lot of people. What is your hope for someone who reads this book? Did you think about that when you were writing your ideal reader and what you wanted them to get out of it?
I don't think there's an ideal reader, because I think people read the book for different reasons. But I was contacted by somebody on Instagram who said they'd read the book. They bought the book in Maine. They were reading it that weekend. They thought it was fantastic. They hadn't built a cabin yet. They really, really wanted to, and they'd got land in California, and they weren't going to. But they said the book was just amazing, and it was just how they envisaged building a cabin, but they weren't going to build one out of wood. They were going to use the Adobe techniques and build it out of mud and brick. And I thought, wow, that to me was really, really wonderful, because they've read my book. Fair enough. They bought my book. Thank you very much. But what they're doing is they're reading this book that's all about log cabins, about my wooden cabin. It's been inspiring them to do something completely different. They're not going, oh yeah, I'm going to build like that because it says so. They're taking what I've written and running with it, and they're going to do something completely different. But it's helped inspire them to do that. I was gobsmacked when I read what they said, and that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of reader, or that's the kind of inspiration I hope the book brings to people.
Not a how-to, but an inspiration manual almost of
Yeah.
giving you the context and the why. And especially if you're building it yourself, that reminder on the hard days why you're doing this, but it's not a cookie cutter. The amount of people that message me on Instagram and just say, can I buy the blueprints? Give me the blueprints. I want this exact cabin. I want to, and it's like, that takes sure, there are blueprints. You can buy them from Pete and he's amazing, but don't you want to personalize it? Don't you want to take what you see and love and create your own space? And I feel like this book allows one to really consider all the possibilities and what feels right to me.
Yeah, I mean, to just buy blueprints, fair enough. If somebody wants to create a rental property to earn money from, fine, buy some blueprints.
Yeah.
Get it built, But like you've done, you employ a designer, and you work with the designer to create something that will be special for you. Now,
Yeah.
then you can rent it out, and then other people can find it special too. But it's the personal attachment. It's the time spent considering the size of a room, where you're going to put the kitchen island, that kind of thing. It's all what makes it personal to you, and that's as much that to me that is as exciting, if not more so, than the actual building it. Because once you're building it, it's just a lot of hard work.
Right.
The design is the true dreaming. This is when you've taken the dreams of Instagram and now you're putting them into, now they're becoming real and they're becoming personal to you. If you can
Right.
do that, that's the exciting part of it.
That's right. It's not copy and paste. It can't be. Even if you're renting it, I posted something about the yoga mat that we have at our cabin the other day. And I got some feedback via DMs. I was like, "Oh, this is a great idea. I'm going to put one at my cabin." And I'm like, "That's totally great. You should do that. I'm sure guests will love it." But almost everything in our cabin is because it's something that I wanted. I was like, "Okay, well, I want to do
Mm.
yoga when I'm disconnecting. So I'm going to put yoga mats in and leave them because someone else might want to." The bookshelf in the loft
Yeah,
is fully curated with recommendations from all of our Instagram followers of their favorite books. And then their recommendation is in our guest book so people can find a book. Well, yes, that is a great amenity for guests, but I did that because I want good books to read when I go
yeah,
to the cabin. So now I have a bookshelf. And I feel like that's always my biggest piece of build advice is like build for you. What makes you happy? Create a space that reflects you. And then you will find the people who value those same things if you're renting it and they can share it with you. But at the end of the day, you're going to be happy with it first and foremost.
exactly. I mean, and if somebody else likes what you've done, that's fantastic. If somebody else comes and they didn't even realize that they liked what you've done until they got there, that's even better. You see, now you've
Yeah,
inspired somebody, but it's personal to you, and it's come through more than buying a set of blueprints,
that's right.
copy and pasting from Instagram. It's
That's right.
it's it's about personal connection.
That's
Everything is
right.
about personal connection.
And if you don't like what I've done, no need for you to comment. That's the other thing that makes me mad when people are like, "You need to do this, this, and this." And I'm like, "I did not build this cabin for you. This is my cabin. I did not ask for your feedback on that. Thank you very much." Oh, Will, this was so great. And I do want you to know how much I enjoyed reading this book.
Well,
Despite
thank you.
spending so much of my days thinking about cabins and talking to people about cabins and posting about cabins, I felt like this book added such a richer context to my understanding of cabins and cabin culture. Can you tell folks if they want to read it where they can find it? Is there a preferred place to order it that's most helpful for you?
Um, no, not for me. I mean, you can order it from wherever. It's available on Amazon, all the online bookstores, the Indigos, that kind of thing. But
Mhm.
if I was to say one thing about where you order it from, buy it from your local bookstore. Go and support your local
Yeah,
bookstore. You'll probably have to order it, but order it. Spend $2 more to get it from there because they want your money and we want them to survive. So yeah,
that's right. That's right. So feel free to Google your own bookstore. We're going to put a link in the episode description on YouTube and on podcast. I will probably put the Amazon link for those folks who are impatient, but above that, I'll probably put a couple links to my local bookstores just because I obviously can't do that for everyone, but that would definitely support them too. So either Google your own bookstore or you can use those links to order them as well. I highly recommend it. I would love to hear from folks afterwards if anyone's interested in doing a book club. I think it would be really fun. There's so much that I've highlighted. It would be fun to talk about that with other folks too. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it with us. Where can folks find you? I don't know if Instagram is a place that you want to connect with readers or like where would be a place that folks could reach out to you?
yeah, I guess Instagram is the best. I think I don't even know what my Instagram is.
That
Bear
feels
with me.
very on brand.
Yes. Um, I don't even
I
know
do
how to
follow you.
find it.
Here,
I
I
think
bet I
it's
can find it.
home.
It
There we go.
is.
Is it Will Jones 373 something like that?
That is it. Yep. And we're going to drop that in the show notes as well so that folks
Yeah,
can find that really easily. And then when we share this, we'll tag you in all of it. So it'll be easy for folks to find you. So thank you. This was such a treat.
that's fantastic. It's been really lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. And if you liked what you heard, feel free to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or share some of your favorite parts over on Apple Podcast. If you have feedback or suggestions for the future, you can also find me on Instagram at Cozy Rock Cabin. Looking forward to next week.